Well, I'm excited to have with me JD Larson. How are you doing, JD?
I'm good. Doing well today. How about yourself?
Excellent. Well, I'm doing well, and I'm really excited to hear about what you're doing in Minneapolis. Read your story, introduced you from a mutual friend and Chris Morton. Tell us about your experience church planting and how that transitioned into something really remarkable, something very unique.
Yeah. How long is this podcast again? I'll try to give you the short story. There's a lot of twists and turns along the way, but my wife and I, along with a group of about 30 people from the church that we were serving as pastors at, felt called to plant a church in 2019 and launched what you would maybe experience as like a typical church plant, with a strong focus on Sunday morning, preaching, worship, um, chairs set up. We were in a community space, got the trailer, all the things. And it was fun. It was going well. We had developed this vision to love our neighbors in the way of Jesus. That's our mission statement. And in the midst of that, one of the things that kept popping up was this idea of table. And we were fascinated with how Jesus would share meals with people as a way of loving them and connecting with them. So we were really interested in that, but didn't really know what that meant in terms of how we were doing church. We tried some things like backyard ice cream parties, meals with neighbors, and all of that felt really exciting. Felt like sort of the exciting edge of our mission of loving our neighbors in the way of Jesus. Uh, and stirred some really good questions like, hey, should this be more a part of who we are? And we were right in the middle of those questions when March 2020 came along. So we were a church plant, a typical church plant, for a hot, 6 months
Wow.
before March 2020, and we were growing. We had actually grown out of our first location. Our first location was really small, so I don't want to like project that we were growing
Oh,
like
I
crazy.
remember
We
planning a church. It starts small. That's right. Every
Yeah, yep,
person matters.
exactly. Yeah. We started in a small space and then moved to a bigger space in quicker than we thought we would, which was exciting. And then everything was just super chaotic. March 2020. I mean, I don't have to share. Like, people get that. I imagine the listeners of this episode get that. So we
Absolutely.
scrambled and survived and tried to adapt and pivot and use that word till it was, useless. And ChristianAnn and I, who my wife and I, who co-pastor the church, we had our third child in the midst of that. We're in Minneapolis, so Minneapolis had sort of two layers of trauma, if you will, going on at the same time. Uh, Everybody had many layers of that the past few years, but
Yeah.
those were our own. So it was really tough, man, really tough. But our community bonded together well over it and learned rhythms on how to survive. But when we as we started to have the capacity to process those experiences and start to ask questions about and start to experiment with what sort of church were we going to be on the other side of this pandemic, or as we kind of relaunched, um, we were living in this reality where we were trying to do hybrid kind of worship gatherings, and we had kind of defaulted pretty strong to what we knew as far as what church was. And that was okay for a while. But it was really clear that the pandemic had changed us and maybe heightened some things that were really valuable to us. At the time, we would say that we really longed for a relationship and a relationally focused expression of church. Uh, Probably because absence makes the heart grow fonder in the midst of what we were experiencing. But then that just became really hard because people started to vote with their feet. And I remember one particular Sunday, it was a February. So it was February in Minnesota is just not a jolly time as it
Not at
is. So,
all. Yeah.
one particular Sunday, so hybrids, so like in person and digital worship gatherings simultaneously. And I looked out like 2 minutes after start and there was like one person there.
Mm.
in person. And I afterwards looked online and there was like maybe 5 or 6. I'm like, okay, this is a moment. There's
Mm.
uh, the church as we had come to know it just couldn't exist anymore. And we had to, at that point in our church planning journey with financial support and stuff, we had basically one more play. We had one more try at an expression of what we felt God was leading us towards. And so we did a lot of hard praying, conversations, dreaming, and God really brought us back to that original seed of a vision for Table. And out of that discernment process, out of those prayers, uh, we basically came to the conviction that God was calling us to be a table-centric church. And we didn't really know what that meant.
Right.
But we had some previous experiences. And so we tried some stuff. And I guess a long story short, which I'm sure you'll have some questions about, is through some experimentation and some just really cool things that God has done over the last almost 2 years now, year and a half, we're now a dinner church. So I'd be happy to share more about that journey and those experiments and who we are today. But that's the long and short of it. And we're back to where we were pre-pandemic, in a totally different way and
Yeah.
with a very renewed and reinvigorated sense of mission and purpose. So
Yeah.
that's a little bit about us.
It's
Yeah.
amazing. Yeah. The timing of when you planted is just could not have been more difficult.
Couldn't have been better, right?
I
Yeah. Like
know. Who knew? But I
yeah.
want to,
Yeah.
I love this idea of dinner church. And I want you just to share, like, what does that mean? What does it look like? How do you um, worship? Who's there? Like, just kind of share a little bit more about
Yeah.
the beauty that you found dinner church to be for you guys.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I had some really similar questions. I think the simplest shift was moving from church around, I talk about it now, like moving from church around a stage to church around a table. So it was like a mindset shift.
Mhm.
And neither of those are bad or better than the other. They're just different forms of how the church takes its life on. Um, so I'll just jump to right to what it looks like for us now, and then I could go on and on about the historical realities of how this is nothing new. I mean,
Right.
it's not something new that we're doing. It's a joyous renovation project or rediscovery or revival of what has actually been a really big part of the church's history for a long time. But what it looks like for us. So when you walk in to dinner church on Sunday at North City Church, we happen to be Sunday evenings at 5. Dinner churches happen throughout the week all over. But 5 o'clock, you walk in, you're greeted maybe much the same way you'd be greeted at a typical church, where there's like maybe a somewhat overly enthusiastic greeter who's like, welcome, glad you're here. But we're, from the moment people walk in, trying to convey our value of hospitality, which is true love of strangers. So we steal this from a book called The Gospel Comes with a House Key. Our aim and our goal is to create a space where neighbors become friends and get invited into the family of God. So the whole experience is sort of built around that. You walk into a community space, there's music going on in the background. Another greeter says, hey, why don't you go ahead and grab a drink and a snack? So it feels a little bit like a house party when you walk in. When you walk in, we're in this community space. So it's this like community room that's set up with tables, and it's not like it's not super fancy, but it's not dingy either. It's like
Right.
this really, I don't know how you describe it. We struggle to describe it, but like it's a comfortable community feel. It doesn't
Love it.
feel too swanky, like you're gonna break something and feel really bad about it,
Right.
but it doesn't feel too like just put together last minute. Like there's some intentionality between in the ambiance. You can sense that when you walk in, and there's a generosity about it. You're invited to sit down and ask, hey, share something that you're grateful for, meet someone new, make some small talk. And then about a couple minutes after 5, an MC hops up on a microphone and says, we're so glad you're here. This is what we call community dinner. It's hosted by North City Church. It's by, for, and with the community. And we're so glad you're here. Our mission is to love our neighbors in the way of Jesus. And Jesus ate with people all the time. That's how he said he loved people, how he expressed his love. So that's what we do. And we're so glad you're here. Now it's time to eat. Let's eat. And you step up to a food line filled with what we love to theologically talk about, an expression of abundance. So it's no like, here's your piece of bread and here's 2 pieces of broccoli, like, no, we eat, and we enjoy eating, and we enjoy eating good food. So there's a full meal, main dish, sides, really good dessert. Like, you can get seconds. Like, it's hopefully one of the better meals you've had in the week, unless you're eating out every night or something like
Right,
that, obviously. But you sit down, and then if you're new there, then you're sitting next to some reasonably friendly strangers. Hopefully, if you're not new, you're connecting with friends that you've made, hopefully, over the last few weeks. We let the meal be a spiritual practice for the next few minutes, and we let the connection across the table, like, man, sociologically, we just don't eat with each other that often as Americans much anymore. So just the joy of like what happens across the table with people, conversations, it feels very much like an extended family gathering or something, or like a grad party or something like that. All the while that you are eating, there is live music being played that's worship music, or what you might call a secular music that is tied to a Jesus story, which I'll get to later.
Oh, cool.
So it feels like a pub, or it feels like a coffee shop, where there's like these moments where you're talking with people next to you, and there's moments where you're like, the person who's leading the music is like saying something between songs, or there's a lyric in the song that catches your attention, and you sit and listen to it. It's very natural to like turn your attention towards the song. It's in that way worshipful atmosphere, because we're singing Jesus songs in the midst of it. And then we got a mess of kids, dude. We've just got so many kids, which is a beautiful sort of unique thing within Dinner Church to ourselves. So kids are running around everywhere, and when the kids are about done eating, the MC will get back up, share a few announcements about what's going on in the community, and then we actually have kids programming in our Dinner Church. So just like church, typically, like, those kids will, up till junior high, will go off to programming that's specific to them, led by team members. And then the junior highs and high schoolers stay with us the whole time. We love having them around the table. We love their reflections on what comes next. Then we introduce something called a community time question, and it just kind of shifts the tone a little bit from just like small talk to a little bit more like you're going a little bit level deeper of life. And so it could be anything from, like, last week it was like, what would you do if you won the lottery? So people can go as deep as they want with that, or as like just stay at the small talk level. But the idea is that, hey, we're gonna try to get to know each other a little bit more here in the next few minutes. And then a communicator, we have a teaching team, comes up and gives a Jesus story. It's not necessarily a sermon. It's not necessarily a Christian devotional. Jesus stories kind of are their own thing, that are a story from Jesus's life that's being retold, but it's being told in the midst of the speaker's story. So it's very kind of like testimonial almost in that sense.
Yeah.
It's not like an explicit, like, there's no altar calls, at least for us, at the end of them. It's just like, hey, this is the main point is, here's a Jesus story, and here's the real authentic difference it makes in my life. And there's this kind of open-ended question at the end, not every time explicitly, but there's this air of like, and it could make a difference in your life. And what difference do you think it could make in your life? And sometimes we explicitly ask that question. Our dinner church does a little discussion time afterwards. Not all dinner churches do. We turn to something we call listening time, where around tables we say, hey, why don't you just talk about this for a few minutes and just share one thing that stood out to you about the Jesus story, and or what difference you think it makes in your life. And we let that go for about 10 minutes. And we actually change this up. This time of year, we practice communion together to end our time during the summer, which I hope I get to talk about summer sometime, because usually we're outside, and usually we're trying to, there's some just great engagement with neighbors because we're just open, like even more open and accessible to the neighborhood. So
Yeah.
just about anybody you can imagine drops by for dinner church, and it's a really fun time. But in the summers, we just end with a blessing. And then the program, quote unquote, the flow and the format is kind of over, but then some of the best stuff happens. And
Mm,
I just call that like the lingering that happens, where like sometimes in the lingering, people are praying for one another, people are
mm,
praying for healing. Sometimes in the lingering, they're talking about the Vikings and that they play the Packers this week, and here's who's going to win.
right.
Sometimes it's just life is happening in the midst of that. Sometimes ministry is happening. Sometimes, hey, we should get together for coffee and talk about that thing that you brought up is happening. And that's dinner church in a nutshell, man.
Yeah.
That's what our Sunday gatherings are like. And yeah, that's what it's like.
And I read some of the story, and it sounds like there are people who are coming to faith, people who are finding
Mhm.
healing. Are you in many ways relying on your people to be able to lead someone to faith?
Mhm.
They know how to do that with the person next to them. If that person's ready, I'm sure a lot of this
Yeah.
is relational, and that might take weeks, months, years for someone
Yeah.
to be ready. But yeah, how are you seeing that transformation from someone who just came for a free meal to, yeah, I really want what you're talking about here?
Yeah. I mean, we've seen across the map, across the board, like someone who comes one or two times, and now is one or two times because of the Jesus story or the conversation they have is like the moment where Jesus is like clearly showing up in their life and they can't deny it.
Hmm.
If we got time, I got a great story about
Oh
that.
yeah, fill us
But
in.
let me just,
Yeah,
I'll finish
yeah,
the answer and I'll come back to that story. And then, yes, we are trying our best to coach our people. We don't have like a evangelism tool, or we don't like, you might call it just like relational evangelism. One of the things that we do coach them with is like, it's awkward to talk to strangers. So there's just like baseline, like, here's how you talk to someone different than you.
yeah.
But the kind of framework that we give them is like a framework from Verlin Fosner, who's written a lot on dinner church. He says that uh, a conversation will naturally flow from life, limitations, then to spirituality. And what he
Mm,
means by that is small talk or just learning about someone's life is quite a gift and kind of the beginning of a beautiful gospel relationship. And then eventually someone will let you know about a limitation or a tension that they're experiencing in your life. And
mm,
that's a moment that as a disciple of Jesus, you should have a listening ear and say, what is God up to in that limitation? Or is there an opportunity to share the good news of Jesus vis-a-vis that limitation? Not like you need Jesus to fix that limitation.
right,
That's not what we're
right,
talking about. But
right.
like there's in every season be able to share the hope of the gospel, that like, and then when someone trusts you with being vulnerable and sharing a limitation, the further in relationship or the deeper the conversation goes, naturally spirituality and how they're understanding spirituality in relation to that limitation will come up. And that every step of the way is ripe for a Jesus follower who's being attentive to the Spirit to be able to proclaim the good news of who Jesus is.
Mm,
And we're just hoping for that sort of reality to
great.
emerge. And it does.
Yeah.
So I can tell you my story about
Yeah, tell us.
the
Yeah,
if
please.
you're this is the story about his name was Kyle. So as I mentioned, in the summertime in Minnesota, we try to be outside and we try to set up right in front of a public pool. It's cool. Minnesota in our neighborhood actually has one of the first natural swimming pools in the
Wow.
US, I think, which means it's like a, a man-made concrete lake. It's fascinating, but I love it
Wow.
because there's no chlorine. It's like naturally filtered. Anyways, that has not much to do with the story. Kyle, who was hanging around the pool, was on his hoverboard when we had our big 16-foot trailer like right in front of the pool entrance, and it was blocking the sidewalk. And the first week he encountered us, he was very irritated because he could not get by us. We literally were in his way. Fast forward to the next week later, Kyle is back in the park. It turns out he actually just lives across the street, and he's now at a bench and he's sitting there staring at us set up for this community. We call them community dinners externally. Internally, we call them dinner church. So we're setting up for community dinner.
Yeah.
And I lock eyes with him like 60 yards away. And the Holy Spirit's like, that's Kyle. Or he didn't tell me his name, but he's like, go talk to Kyle.
That's the one,
So
right?
I learn Kyle's name, hear more about him. And he's just got this kind of like sort of perplexed look on his face the whole time. Like there's something going on that I don't know about, but I kind of roll with it. I invite him over to dinner. I'm like, dude, we're having burgers tonight. Come get a burger. This whole time he starts telling me his story, and I can just see this look in his eyes, like something's perplexing him. But he goes into his story, and it's just this miraculous, amazing story. So Kyle, months later, was in a medically induced coma for several months.
Goodness.
And before that was an atheist, woke up from that coma. And as soon as he woke up, he said, he's told God, he's like, I'm not going to deny you anymore. Clearly you're real if you brought me out of this. And he showed me pictures of what he looked like before his coma. He was like a bodybuilder, ripped dude. But the Kyle that was sitting with me around that table was like one of the skinniest guys there, and had just this crazy story of he believed God had brought him and saved him out of that coma. And he said, ever since, I've been hoping that Jesus would show up in my life and share more about what it would mean for me to have a relationship with him. I'm like, just like, you can't even make this stuff up. And so he's like, and I've just been asking God, like, hey, will you show up? And I haven't really gone to church or anything. And I listened to a little Christian radio, but some of that was good. Some of it was weird. But he's like, and then he starts almost crying. And he says, the day that I asked Jesus to show up, you guys were literally in my way in the park. And I came back the week later, and here you are, and you came all the way across this park and you talked to me. And at this point, like I said, we don't have a stage at North City. We have a rug, and I'm supposed to give the Jesus story. And my worship coordinator, the person who plays the music, is like from the microphone going like, hey, JD, are you anywhere? And I'm just like shushing her off, because I'm like, no, I got to stay in this moment.
It's too good,
and I'm
right?
like, it's too good. And I'm like, well, Kyle, I think Jesus is trying to talk to you, man. I think like us being here is Jesus's way of saying that he's here and he's here for you. And the dude just starts, this previous bodybuilder just starts bawling. So part of what I take from it, and Kyle hung out with us for a while. He had to move, but after that day, he's like, hey, no, it'd be funny. You should call my mom and tell her that I'm at church right now, because she would not believe you for $1 million. And so we get those stories, Eric, like that happens. Great. And it's just from, yes, it's from proclaiming Jesus, but mostly it's just showing up. And most of those situations are like, Jesus was already sort of like in Kyle's life, and we just got the privilege to be the one. I theologically talk about dinner church as setting a Jesus table, and Jesus is there, and he's the leader of it, and he's present. And our job is really to kind of just try to attune to his presence, the Holy Spirit's presence, and to the presence of our neighbor, and expect that something sacred will happen when we're like attuned to those realities.
I love it. Well, if someone wanted to hear more or learn more about what you're doing, what's a good website they should go to?
Yeah. Great place to start is just dinnerchurches.com. I'm a part of the team that leads a lot of that stuff. And if you want to learn more about Dinner Church, that was the place we started in learning more. The Church from Fresh Expressions US. If you haven't heard of us, check us out. I'm on the team now, and we help people explore what Dinner Church looks like, so they can check that out. If they want to get connected with me or learn more about North City's story and our expression of Dinner Church, they can look at what we're doing at northcitychurchmpls.com. So the MPLS stands for Minneapolis. And northcitychurch.com was not available when I was a church planner looking for a URL, which is why we've got a mouthful of a URL, but it's northcitychurchmpls.com.
Perfect.
JD at northcitychurchmpls.com is my email if people want to reach me directly.
Wonderful, JD. Well, thanks for what you're doing in that part of the world. Grateful for the time with you. Keep up the great work.
Thanks, Eric. Appreciate it.